Greetings. My name is Francisco Aragon, and I direct Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. Welcome to Curated Conversations, a Latinx Poetry Show. Today's program features Jacqueline Balderrama in conversation with Cynthia Hogue, discussing Jackie's book, Now in Color, winner of the Perugia Press Prize. But before I pass the baton to and introduce Cynthia, I want to thank a few people. The Writers Center has agreed to host us on their platform, and I want to thank Zach Powers, Director of Communications. From day one, it's been such a pleasure working with Zach, whose tech expertise and savvy for all things related to communications have been indispensable. I also want to thank Executive Director Margaret Melanie for her endorsement and support. A shout out as well to Angela Spring of Duende District Bookstore, whose crucial assistance with the book club component of this initiative has been seamless. I'm so pleased that Duende District is our third co-presenter. Finally, a program as ambitious as this one that will involve 24 participants, would not be possible without funding. The Poetry Foundation is our principal institutional benefactor. In addition, I want to thank Jim Wilson, whose generous patronage is making possible the alluded to book club. In fact, leading the discussion of Jackie's book will be poet David Campos. One of the special traits of Curated Conversations is that we ask the debut Latinx poet in question to select their interlocutor. Jacqueline Balderrama has invited Cynthia Hogue, a former teacher and mentor. Between original collections of poetry, translated collections of poetry, and edited volumes, Cynthia has had a hand in at least 16 books. Having Cynthia on board with our initiative prompted me to do something that was long overdue. I say long overdue with a considerable degree of contriteness, for Cynthia has been a professional colleague for a number of years since we served together a while ago on the Board of Trustees of the AWP. Thankfully, these past few weeks have afforded me the immense pleasure of shuttling between two of her tomes. First of all, in June, The Labyrinth, a volume I would describe as an arresting, elegiac, book-length poem in sections, one which deploys a rich array of textual borrowings and inspirations. And secondly, Fortino Samano, the overflowing of the poem, a collaborative poetic sequence by Virginia Laluc and Jean-Luc Nancy. Cynthia's co-translator from this French text was Sylvain Gallet. Here's a snippet to give you a taste. The poem is cerebral, its writing physical, a nonchalant sway, pressure of moods. Let it spurt, flow all over, everywhere. Can I? Should I photograph this, the overflowing of the poem? I'm pleased to welcome Cynthia Hogue.
Thank you so much for that. And thank everyone involved in this initiative because it's exciting. It's been wonderful to be a part of it. And I really appreciate Jackie asking me to interview you. That's been really, really wonderful to see you again in this light of your beautiful debut volume. So I'm going to introduce you just a little bit more formally before we start. Jacqueline Balderrama, Jackie, as I know her, completed her MFA at Arizona State University, which is where we first encountered each other and worked a bit on some of the poems that I recognize are revised for Now in Color. And she was involved there with Letras Latinas, I think probably for the first time at ASU. In addition, she was teaching in ASU's Prison Education Program. Now in Color, which received the Perugia Press First Book Prize in 2019, is her debut volume, as you know. She also published a chapbook in 2019 with Finishing Line Press entitled Nectar and Small. She's currently the Vice Presidential Administrative Fellow at the University of Utah, where she's also serving as a poetry editor of Quarterly West. She will defend her dissertation in about a month because Dr. Balderrama will be returning to ASU this summer as the 2021-2022 Piper Fellow at the Virginia J. Piper Center for Creative Writing. So, and with that, I think we'll start our more informal, but still curated conversation, Jackie.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you to you especially, and Francisco and Zach Powers and Letras Latinas and the Writers Center for making this happen. It's really nice to speak over this book with you, one of my mentors who I think so highly of. So thank you for taking the time.
Wonderful. So your collection opens with an immediate focus on language as language, with these recurring poems. I've described them as linguistic investigations or meditations on what language actually does and name, but they look like definitions without actually maybe being definitions. And they seem to explore how language morphs across boundaries, across linguistic borders. So let's start with you reading the first poem, Esperanza, in your volume, Now in Color. And are you able to screen share?
So can you see this, Cynthia? All right. So the first poem in the book, Esperanza. Esperanza, noun, feminine. Migration is written on this green heartache of home, once its own discovery of water. The Aztecs Mextlico, meaning place in the center of the moon. Some are used to hopes being where they've been, but singing one octave is Kansas to Oz. For a while, my father didn't know that the movie changed to Technicolor since the family TV was black and white. I'll go ahead and stop share and respond to your question, Cynthia.
So we can see then how the poem is formatted and how it occupies the space. One question is this a definition? And if it's not a definition, what is it doing?
I think I first thought of these as serving as definition poems to sort of orient myself a bit more to the Spanish language, since I'm not a fluent speaker and didn't grow up speaking Spanish. So part of the book was working to reconnect myself with that historical past. But I think as I began to write these, I was discovering that, as you say, they sort of are more linguistic investigations or meditations. And I like that idea of meditation as using this word as sort of a doorway or a focal point on which to sort of focus the energy or the imagery in the poem. And particularly for this poem, Esperanza, which translates to hope, it was a poem I wrote. I think it was the last of the language poems, the Spanish quote unquote definition poems or not definition poems. And I knew that I wanted it to do the work of communicating, I think, the complexity of that hope that migrants feel when they're moving from one place that they know and have lived into a new place that sort of represents, that possibility for a better life. And I initially wanted to move past, sort of our contemporary understanding of that kind of migration going on today and push it back to sort of the Aztecs, which were wandering in the space of the Mexican Valley, or the city of Mexico, where that would sort of space was originally. And they were looking for this sacred sign of an eagle on a cactus, devouring a serpent, which is now, the symbol on the Mexican flag. And so discovering their original name for that space, Mextlico, which I have trouble pronouncing, and understanding that that was like a Nahuatl, a language. They didn't have written language then, and that was then sort of translated phonetically and then adopted by the Spanish into what has now become Mexico. But it was so sort of lovely to sort of experience the translation of that original word placed in the center of the moon, which in other definitions, there's also, it's called like the belly button of the moon, or the umbilicus. And it's because Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, originally was built on this lake. And so seeing it from the mountaintops, you can kind of go in and see it's at the center of the moon, maybe the lake reflecting the stars, which I think is really beautiful. So I guess, yeah, in terms of like the imagery that I'm connecting that translation and that meditation, that served as like a really productive way of thinking through this. And then bringing in the imagery from The Wizard of Oz, which also is about dreams and hope, right? And has that travel happening like sonically in the octave, and the sound of somewhere over the rainbow is kind of a way I wanted to also connect this poem to a lot of the cinematic themes in the book too.
It's so interesting that you've got the frame around this pseudo definition. It actually reminds me of the title of my translation that Francisco mentioned, The Overflowing of the Poem. So you start out one place with hope, but the first word of the poem is migration. Yeah. And then it moves really by association, associative thinking through that. But is the poem contained by the what I've called the box-like structure, or is it framed? Yeah. And that might actually lead into your talking a little bit about how all of these framed poems, these pseudo definitions, help to organize or punctuate or launch each section of your book. If you could talk a bit about that.
I love the way you're talking about the framing of the poems, because I think a lot of this book has to do with sort of perception and reorienting that, and what affects our understanding of how we experience the world, whether it's sort of color coming into film or not. I will say that the framing in the little box around those poems, I had sort of originally thought of them maybe as like flashcards or note cards. That became a really productive way of presenting it. But my editor at Perugia and the book designer sort of came up with that box. And I was just like so pleased to see that come through, and then help to sort of communicate the value of emphasizing that these were, in a way, section breaks between the poems. Originally, in very early drafts, all these poems were sort of just stacked in a single space. And, I had the thought, a few summers before it was actually accepted, to sort of break it apart and use this sort of emphasis on language to be the guiding force for the book. And so I think by doing that, it really helped me to think of the arc of the book as well. Mm-hmm. You'll notice, for people who maybe know the sort of more direct definitions of these words, they sort of help decide which poems to put after them. So I have one poem called Relato, which is story, and you can kind of hear how it sounds like relate or retell. And so behind that language poem, there are the poems that involve the interviews I had with my grandfather, so his stories. And behind, I think, Estrella, meaning wake, there are sort of some poems about migration. So I was using these words to sort of group those poems and kind of, I think of a more, I guess, maybe fluid transition than having sort of maybe those more traditional, like section 1, section 2, section 3.
Yes, fluidity is really, really important to your collection because it links up, of course, with the associative movement by which you are actually developing the poems. It also links up with migration and how the language, you open with the Spanish word, and then you populate the poem with Nahuatl words here and there. And it's like the English is making room or accommodating, or the poem becomes hybrid linguistically. Yeah. Is there something more you want to say about that at this point, or we can circle back to your relationship
to
language?
That, I had feelings about what to italicize in this book, and ultimately decided, like, if it was being spoken in the poem, whether it was English or Spanish, to italicize it. But you definitely, or at least I definitely, came across sort of the decisions like, well, do I put an accent on the E in Mexico for it to be Mexico, or the other way around? But, most of the book is in English, as growing up, that is my native language. So yeah, it did sort of have investigations on how to present that, and interest, I think, in the origin of where language comes from, and sort of how that develops, across generations in a family.
Also, your awareness of language. Alberto Rios would always say, when he would visit my translation class, he would say, I write in English, but I think in Spanish.
Yeah.
So it gives that difference to the language. And obviously you're not thinking in Spanish if English is your native language, but you have a kind of double awareness always that runs throughout the book, that first poem certainly announces, and you return us to again and again. But I want to go to the second poem then, your title poem.
Yeah.
Which is really on notions of migration, which is the second word in the whole book, right, in your container poem. And I wonder if you would read that for us now, and then we can talk about it a bit on the other side.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Would you like me to share the screen on that one as well?
Yes, because you have these wonderful little stepped or reverse step stanzas that I'd like people to see visually. Yeah.
Okay, let me go ahead and share that. Okay, make it a little bit bigger. All right. Now in color. Migratory patterns of monarchs continue alongside gray wolves, armadillos, coyotes. Now paper, now papel. We learn to listen in different ways. And again, someone asks for the source of me, as if water could stop or would. Agents dress us in the terms of their casting calls. Anonymous beneath the sombrero, or fiery Latina, or gardener, or alien, or drug lord. Now Maria Montez, Katie Gerardo, Rita Hayworth watch themselves in the funny mirror. And my mother shakes her head for the childhood dog, the neighbors took in, then abandoned in the desert. Now the wildfires on the San Bernardino mountains. At night, families set out lawn chairs to watch the flames. And a man electrifies his fences and shows the reporter large photos of bodies he's found beneath his trees. Now the radio is breathless. The television, like an escape portal, streams color through undraped windows. But inside, we are still here, fumbling to turn on the light or floating down in our chairs, wishing the room to unleash its plum, its marigold, the blue of our jeans, the white walls covered with frames. We peel heavy shadows from broomsticks, coils of rope, strangers, admitting somehow we can still have good days. Somewhere desert poppies will grow with all of this and without it.
So what strikes me so much with this poem is it has a different kind of framing. So you open with the migration of monarch butterflies and some other animals like coyotes and wolves, following their prey, regardless of borders, right? And you end with the poppies, which will grow with all of this and without it. That kind of very, very naturalistic, almost fatalistic force of nature happening regardless of all of this. What's all of this?
Yeah.
What are you kind of condensing into that dictic, this?
Yeah, I'll jump back a little bit to sort of contextualize my approach to coming to this ending. And I wanted to begin with the natural rhythms of migration, with animals that I think is easy for us to recognize, but also to recognize that migration, I think, is a part of our human nature too, being hunter-gatherers, all this sort of leading up of moving from one place to another. And a lot of the poem, in a sense, sort of focuses on the difficulties of spaces that we need to be resilient, or plants in the desert have this incredible resilience, but also acknowledging those of privilege. So in just the lines before the ending, saying, admitting somehow we can still have good days. Myself and many others, we don't live the lives of the migrant trying to cross the border or trying to cross the desert, which in a sense has been weaponized because there are so few ports of entry, and it's using, our government is relying a lot of times on these natural barriers that are very dangerous to cross. So in a way, my hope with the final line was to end on an image that, we can envision that, these flowers might grow regardless, with what's going on in the world. Because nature, animals, plant life, they don't sort of have the conscious choices we might have. And so what does it mean to think of this happening in a space where everything that's been spoken up to the poem has happened? And what does it mean to imagine that, the future could be different? What would our world look like if we could live without this, acknowledge and address, the real harm that's going on with the tensions on our border. And, that's sort of built up, at least in this poem, where a lot of people are watching, right, through the television or watching the fire on the mountains. What choices and decisions do they have to make to, have a better ending,
Yeah, there's that sense in which you're aware throughout the volume of the spectacle of migration, that the suffering of migrants has been made into a spectacle, if you will, or the cruelty that people so casually discussed, like the rancher who had electrified his fence and then photographs the bodies, right? Or the reference in a later poem, I'm not sure which one it is, but to the stabbing of the water bottles that have been put out for migrants who get lost on the way, and the dire consequences. So there's a sense in which empathy is really working, so interwoven with your observations, Jackie, and your sense of history and moment. And there's a kind of mending eye that you, or awareness that you bring in this poem that I hadn't thought about.
I mean, experiencing, just on the news and things you see, and I think it, it was a reporter through a channel I then accessed to YouTube of this, farmer or landowner on the border who electrifies his fences, and was showing this reporter of the bodies he's found beneath his trees who may have died due to, lack of hydration, all these other and it's just crushing to see, in a way, the lack of empathy, but also a lack of direction on what to do. And so, voicing some of these really difficult images in the poem is a way, I think, to, reflect ourselves back to us. I think once my hope is maybe, if we recognize this and see ourselves as complicit, or at least participating, in what's happening, that opens the door for change.
Wonderful. Very, very good point. I wanted to bring you forward to one of the historical poems that you have. It's the Fragmented Apology, 2006. This will be the last screen share I asked you, probably.
No problem.
Maybe not. But there's a poetics question of formatting in this poem as well. Most obviously with the slashes, but if you could screen share that so that we can and read the poem, so that we can see how you read those lines with the slashes.
Right, let me just pull it up.
On page 10, yeah.
Let's see.
And then of course you have to explain the poem, the history. I can't tell you how many times I Googled facts that you included in your book. So I feel like I've learned a lot about the history out of which you're writing too.
Certainly, and I'll sort of share a little bit about the history of this piece before I get into it, and hopefully that helps contextualize it for our viewers a bit more. So this poem was written in response to the Apology Act for the 1930s Mexican Repatriation Program. And essentially what was happening in the 1930s is that roughly an estimate is that 2 million people of Mexican ancestry across the United States were forcibly relocated back to Mexico. This was during the Depression, and Mexican Americans were being blamed for quote unquote stealing jobs that I guess should have gone to white people. And so this poem, and I mean, in California alone, California was the one who issued the apology. So there were other states that I guess at this point haven't apologized, but in California, it was estimated, of the 2 million, over half of those people were actually, US citizens. And in California alone, it was thought to be 400,000 people were actually born in this country. So this poem responds to that. The apology was issued or made official in 2006. And I believe there was like a plaque, and since then, some legislation to say that this should be taught in schools. So this poem responds to that. Fragmented Apology, 2006. When the knocking comes, county agents are on the porch telling Mexicans, you should go in 2 weeks. Here are the tickets. Here's your destination. In raids, hundreds at La Placita Park, detained for papers, vans idling in the peripheries, while their children at school wait. And threats for some families are real enough to leave. How can this be called voluntary? As a heartbreak, as a life packed and thrown across the hills? Who knew and said nothing, and still says nothing? Who went turning off the house lights because no one was home? Imagine the people in the train car, the girl whispering the moon is following her to the make-believe town, become real, become vacant looks on her parents' eyes. In reflection, a little oasis of nothing. And you, lucky to know someone or not, some can speak the language or can't. One woman must paint her belonging until there's a bridge and in the distance, a steeple.
It's such a beautiful poem, and it ends on such a resonant image of painting your connection, right?
Yeah.
The bridge, is it a bridge back or is it a bridge forward? You refrain from telling us, right? That's great. So let's talk about that typographical innovation that you used, the slashes, which seem to both connect and divide in important ways.
Yeah, there are slashes used throughout the books, and sometimes they're dealing with the notion of hybridity in the movements of those poems. I think I was reading Shane McCrae's Mule at the time, which sort of deals with identity and hybridity in the same ways, or in similar ways. But in this piece, I found that the slashes were a really productive feature to sort of represent that brokenness or divisiveness, and also that joining of lines. So I kind of have, I guess, like to think about it as sort of this broken ceramic that's been glued back together. It still shows the sort of visibility of those breaks. And yet, reading it, you kind of have the choices about, do you enunciate those pauses more? How do you think through sort of visually grouping the lines? So I found it useful to sort of group words that were like, let's see, here are the tickets, here's your destination, having those parallels, but also I think it helps to emphasize some of those smaller words found within lines, where usually when we have just a line appearing, it's the end words that receive that kind of emphasis.
Yeah, so you could do some real linguistic highlighting at the intra-line as well as across the lines.
Mm-hmm.
It also seemed to me, and you tell me if this seems accurate or feels accurate, that the slashes are abrupt. You can use other forms like the dash, right? The Emily Dickinson dash, for example, or actual line breaks to separate the attenuated line, for example. But the slash seems to reference the lived experience of the people who were deported, that it's abrupt.
Yeah.
And yet you can see the other side.
Yeah, visually just having that line, literally breaking apart those groupings of words. It's not something easy to move through, or a dash sort of, I think, suggests that movement, right? Oh, move here. Whereas a break sort of suggests, oh, should this be broken onto the next line? That sort of thing. Yeah, and just sort of thinking through the title too, the Fragmented Apology, California, as far as I'm aware, being the only state to offer that apology, that seems sort of fragmented when this affected so many more people, than those just living in California.
So the pieces, an apology in pieces,
Mm-hmm.
literally, the pieces never put together to make it whole. Great. Okay. So what I loved about this poem was just the way it was lyrically invoking a very complex history. You do that well throughout. But I think it's time that we have to get to Hollywood, right? We've thought when we were talking about it yesterday, and even some years ago when you were still in the MFA program, I was very interested in your fascination with, for example, Rita Hayworth. And in a poem-like study of self-portrait, you call her her transformation a transformation montage.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know what that means to you, but I just want to say these are elements that are recurring throughout of color and identity, which you complicate a lot by invoking a movie like The Wizard of Oz, right? But watching it on a black and white TV. Obviously migration, but also mimicry and tropes of imitation and parenting, parroting,
Yeah.
and then self-transformation. So let's just take a poem-like study of self-portrait and talk about, what does Rita Hayworth mean to you? What does Maria Montez mean to you? Why these poems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking mimicry is something I think largely that we learn as children, or we learn how to learn by mimicry. And just my encounter with films growing up, and not really seeing people like me as represented as sort of the white traditional, I don't know, heroine, we might call it. So, I mean, in writing this piece, I was really negotiating sort of my feelings around this idea that I have been sort of influenced by dominant cultures that prioritize or idealize certain body types or certain ideas of beauty. And even it's sort of like that Cinderella moment, that transformation, whether it's someone getting a makeover or a house being redone. I'm like very attracted to see this like progression from like the before and the after, but that becomes very problematic when you apply it to people, right? And when cultures are being affected, and when certain people are represented on film. So I was sort of addressing that attraction and also repulsion to, I think, the transformations that I was seeing in a lot of these movie stars at the time. So Rita Hayworth, being she had a Spanish father and an American mother, and she grew up dancing, and that was sort of how she was discovered, but went through these sort of really intense makeover where her hairline was altered. She must have had like 7 different hair colors at one point. And she was able to sort of fill these roles by conforming to sort of some beauty standards of at the time, instead of being maybe a little bit more exoticized like the Maria Montez character is in the following poem. And so I was interested in seeing the effect that has on someone, and even myself, like, I guess when people are represented on film, what does that mean? The character of Maria Montez, this queen of Technicolor in the following poem, even though she was playing these sort of like exoticized parts, was really meaningful to my grandmother, who could sort of hear her Spanish accent under the English words when she was watching the films, and even sort of altered her name to sort of mean the same thing. My grandmother's maiden name was Montez, spelled a little different than Montez. And after the sort of actress had her stardom, they altered it. So I'm fascinated by the ways in which we can see these transformations like occurring on film, and also kind of get the backstories that those actors or actresses took part in, and sort of where the power dynamics lie. Where is the pressure to assimilate or exoticize or represent this as other?
Yes, that there were certain clear avenues towards that enabled access to dominant culture, right? That forced Rita Hayworth into, in essence, passing for her American mother or her English mother, and denying her Mexican father. It reminds me of the kind of splicing that you were writing about with the films about Pancho Villa, where some of the film footage was actual documentary footage of the Mexican Revolution, and later spliced into real representations, reenacted representations.
Yeah.
So Mexicans as real representation, REEL, right? And there was just the stereotyping, the exoticizing, or the assimilating.
Yeah.
So
yeah. With that, the footage from the Mexican Revolution, I mean, there were sort of journalists and filmers going down, and, you know, they had a lot of limitations with the kind of cameras they were doing because you had to crank it. And so some of the choices that went into like reshooting some of those scenes was because you couldn't get the intimacy you could with like close-ups and all of that when you were sort of on the battlefield and getting this footage. So yeah, reworking a narrative to sort of suit your own, or deciding how to frame it. Pancho Villa later fell out of favor with the US, and then resulted in Mexico, and then, like, you know, a lot of that footage was lost, so or melted for silver. Yeah, it's kind of I was really pleased about how much history and film really was something I could really explore with this book, and how far it went back, because the Mexican Revolution was when my ancestors entered this country.
Okay, yeah. It's another way of, you know, you have the language encounters between Spanish and English framed throughout the book, and the framing of Mexican Americans for consumption, right? A Hollywood stereotyping that Rita Hayworth was able to, you know, more fluidly move in and out. Let's move to, pardon?
Oh, she was available for more roles, you know, not just, you know, being typecast as sort of a Spanish actress.
Yeah, yeah. She had an array of sex symbols, didn't she?
Right, yeah, they still had to develop her.
She was framed in other ways. I want to make sure we leave some time for your very, very beautiful lullaby, and then the poem Water Theory. So let's just move to lullaby and touch on that, because your empathy is just so beautifully lyrical.
Yeah. So,
would you read that, Jackie?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Let me pull it up. Canción de Cuna, a lullaby for children affected by the 2018 zero tolerance policy. Outside, past the ceiling, La Luna Lunera shines up and down the long, dark road. There, the tails of frogs begin to disappear, with the hum, sana, sana, colita de rana. And there, the chicks in the cold are saying, pew, pew, pew. There, the branches of wild plums let fall their small fruits for crickets and a hungry mouse. And there, somewhere, your mother is singing to you, aruru and good night, and prayers on the rosary of her fingertips. Nuestra Señora de las Lágrimas, Our Lady of Tears, may we all grow a little more by daylight, as does the olive, as does the orchard.
Just an exquisite poem. And it comes out of such a brutal policy, just absolutely heartless and inhumane, the consequences of which are still being felt and which a new administration is trying to address. Why write a lullaby?
Yeah. I mean,
why turn to the lyric?
I knew I wanted to write a poem about what was happening. And I was having trouble accessing how to do that in a way that I felt was appropriate. And it ended up being, I was listening to recordings of the children crying that were locked up in cages. And, you just have this feeling that you want to comfort them. And, this trauma is going to be felt for a lifetime. So I thought, what better than a lullaby, something that is intended to comfort and calm and tell you, it will be better tomorrow. So, it's not a song in the sense or a lullaby that replicates, I think, the forms and traditions of lullabies that rhyme a lot, but I do think it's song-like. And I sort of thought a bit about my own upbringing and the stories and nursery rhymes that I had heard. And so Goodnight Moon was one of those. And so the moon became a bit of this, I guess, a focal point, the connection between, you can see the same moon. Even if you can imagine it, it's there between the children who are locked up and their parents. We're not sure where they are, right? And I also turned to Spanish and Latin American lullabies. So there are a few images that I was saying, should someone eventually read this poem, would recognize, some of the songs that are referenced here. So La Luna Lunera is a lullaby that exists. Luna is moon. Lunera is sort of just a made up sort of word to sort of have that sound to it. And the frogs and the olives were also sort of these appearing figures in these nursery rhymes, which often involve, a lot of nature and animals. And so, yeah, I mean, also coming from a Catholic background and seeing photos of a lot of the confiscated items that were taken from migrants when they crossed or were detained at the border. There was this photo series where a janitor had basically taken these things out of the trash and grouped them and categorized them. And one of those photos was just all the rosaries that had been confiscated. And so what you do, and I did growing up, when you don't have a rosary, is you count the decade on your fingertips. So it was just sort of a investigation into sort of some of the imagery that I thought would be comforting and I don't know, help to contribute to some of the healing that is going to be much needed, hopefully when this sort of crisis is resolved.
Yes, when questions of the role of art, aesthetics, beauty, the lyric come up when there's large social issues like that. One of the aspects that you talk about is appealing to that intimacy, the shared places that all can see the moon, that nature impacts us, and yet with that double consciousness, knowing that these children not only are suffering, but will continue. So you're thinking of the mending, the ameliorating quality, that beauty has.
There's a lot of growth. I mean, we think of growth, but there's a lot of growth, we can do it, whether the scale of an olive or an orchard, right, that needs to happen to improve the reality of these events.
And it is a different connotation of adaptability, isn't it? You're dwelling on that throughout. And so we have about 7.5 minutes left, which I
Flown by, but it's been so delightful.
really has. I want to ask you to read Water Theory. You and I are living in the Western United States, which is undergoing a 20-year drought. And it's now recognizably climate change, right? There's so much water. There's so many animals. There's so much nature. And yet, you anchor with history and you anchor with notions of fluidity and the resilient aspects of migration. So I thought it would be good to look at the way, or just hear the way you reimagine borders and those who cross borders as some of our most resilient and fluid forces, people, that borders both contain, but they are also permeable, right? Yeah. So if you'll read the poem, and then whatever you would like to say about it, I will simply add, but not at the end, is that you conclude like Dickinson. This world is not conclusion, she says. And you say nothing concludes.
Yeah.
So you'll read the poem. Thank you.
Would you like me to share it as well?
I think we won't take the time for this. Yeah.
Water Theory. If the moon's surface was composed of waves, the way Da Vinci thought, moon ocean reflecting the sun and our dark sea's faint glow, borders might be understood in temperatures, or currents, or light, fish sustaining themselves in the cold rock, the warped water, our planet at arm's length like a hot pearl. During red tide, the waves bring jellyfish you don't see until you do. A lifeguard washes stings with a spray bottle of vinegar. On Cornish beaches, reports say Legos have washed up since 1997 when a shipment was lost. Occasionally, a sea monster arrives, a 13-foot oarfish, a log covered in goose barnacles. Third graders learn about the universal solvent, but there are always exceptions. During the density experiment in water, oil and honey divide into colored rings. In the Great Salt Lake, some tourists in their hats bob like corks all day in the green water. Monet's bridge over the lily pond is a dark curve in reflection. In Impression Sunrise, his bay dashes blue and orange on a wash of faded violet. Nothing concludes in the current, through and through. Have you seen the video of the zebra attacked by the lion? The lion clamps on the zebra's neck, but the zebra lowers her further into water. Out of breath, the lion must let go. I found for this poem, water is sort of a generative image for me that I often turn to, and was really useful, I think, in connecting a lot of the images in the book. We start with sort of the lake on which Mexico City is founded, and then thinking about the fluidity of water as sort of a way to think about ancestry, traveling from one generation to the next. And now I've sort of grouped a few other meditations on the element, which is all about this sort of fluidity of changing states. And I was very pleased to have discovered how Da Vinci thought there was an ocean on the moon. And it sort of created, for me at least, this bookend of thinking that in the beginning of migration, you're reaching for the moon, and now in this piece, you're sort of reaching back for the earth. It's at arm's length like a hot pearl, trying to close that distance. And, you know, seeing the earth from outer space, you notice there aren't the same sort of boundaries or borders that we see and encounter in daily life when things are sort of just minimized to like the land and the water. And so it kind of became this new way of seeing something hopeful. And the other images, sort of the ways water moves, or the ways you can represent it in painting or utilize it as the zebra does to escape her captor. It became a really generative image for me to conclude with this book.
And that's a wonder. That's just a wonderful motif of the zebra who is surely wounded,
Yeah.
but will survive. Right, thanks to the water.
No,
it's a wonderful motif, yeah,
mm-hmm.
for migrants.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jackie. Beautiful. Bravo.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you.
Great to talk to you. Gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate all the questions and being able to speak about this book with you. Many of the poems which began at Arizona State. So
he did, but I do not remember the ekphrastic series beginning. That has to be more recent. Yes, and the container poems, the framed language poems. Yeah. But you've clearly deepened your relationship to language, to Spanish. You were just really getting started at ASU, as I recall.
I hope so. You had given me a copy of Gloria Anzaldua's Water Frontera, which was, you know, eye-opening for me, who had never encountered her work, and was really, I think, a guiding force for this book too, in terms of thinking about language and borders.
Yeah. And she had the same issue that you had. We might have talked about it several years ago, that she did not want Spanish to be italicized, which is the typography for foreign languages, right? But when I was working on Innovative Women Poets, and we tried to honor that, she had died, and she had never gotten that into her estate papers. She apparently said it verbally to one of her executors, but not to the others. So Spanish had to, by the terms of the estate, Spanish had to be italicized.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Whereas you have the option.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I mean, sometimes you need teachers to learn how to break the rules too, right?
I love that. If I help to teach you how to break rules, oh, right.